Hey,
Yeah?
what the hell is this?
Oh, you didn't really give any specific guidelines about mating.
Did you name it?
What?
Did you name it?
Yeah, he's...
Pendulum.
Yeah? Well, it's gonna be a hell of a lot harder for you now because he's going the overboard.
Since Konami has announced that Arc 5 is coming to Duel Links, you're probably wondering what new cards we will get to play with soon. In Arc 5, the show focuses on these new fancy cards called Pendulum Monsters. The new mechanic features the iconic Pendulum Summoning, hated by Konami for putting out a lot of advantage when used properly. You may have watched the anime or played in the TCG OCG, but I want this video to be aimed to new players who have completely no idea what Pendulum Monsters are and how they work. However, this video still includes various quirks about the pendulum mechanic that some veteran players may still get wrong. Before we get to the video proper, I would like to note that this video was written up before the release of Arc 5 in Duel Links. As such, the information I'll be showing is based on the TCG OCG and what Duel Link assets that have been leaked. In this video, I'll be talking about 5 things. What is a Pendulum Monster? What is Pendulum Summoning? What happens if a Pendulum Monster leaves the field? How do you play Pendulum Monsters? And how do you counter Pendulum Monsters? I'll be providing timestamps for each section in the description below in case you are interested in only a particular section. In this section, I'll be talking about the surface features of a Pendulum card and the general text that are associated with them. To showcase, here are 3 Pendulum cards. They are Clifford Scout, Lunite Tiger, and All Eyes Rebellion Dragon. I will focus more on the main deck Pendulum Monsters as they are much more common than extra deck Pendulum Monsters. However, their mechanics are nearly identical. Just note that extra deck Pendulum Monsters are brought out like regular Fusion, Synchro, or Xyz monsters, but have a monster effect that lets them be placed in the Pendulum Zone. Pendulum Zones are the left and rightmost spell trap zones, and Pendulum Monsters can be placed in those zones either from the hand or from card effects. Pendulum Monsters in these zones would oftentimes be referred to as scales, which are the numbers near to the red and blue diamonds. These numbers indicate what monsters you can Pendulum summon. When Pendulum Monsters are in the Pendulum Zone, they are treated as spells upon being successfully activated on the field. You are not allowed to set Pendulum Scales, and they must be played face up. To negate their activation, you need to negate a spell. But Pendulum Scales are not treated as any specific type of spell, just a spell in general. They are not considered as normal spells, quick play spells, field spells, equip spells, nor continuous spells. This means that activating them still gives spell counters, which is why there are many Pendulum Monsters focused on spell counters. While in the Pendulum Zone, Pendulum Monsters gain their Pendulum effects, which are the effects listed in the top effect box. These Pendulum Zones cannot be replaced by another Pendulum Monster unless the zone is vacated. When Pendulum Monsters are not in the Pendulum Zones, these Pendulum Monsters will be treated as monsters, which are in the main deck, hand, monster zones, graveyard, banish pile, and even in the extra deck. That's right, Pendulum Monsters go face up in the extra deck when they will be sent to the graveyard from the field. If they were sent from anywhere else to the graveyard, they will still be sent to the graveyard normally, for example, through a Foolish Burial. While in the main deck, Pendulum Monsters are always treated as a Pendulum card and can be searched and interacted by cards that mention so. In the deck, they can still be searched by normal means, such as Summoner's Art for Clifford Scout and Tenki for Lunite Tiger. And that concludes the info dump that is the introduction to Pendulum Monsters. I will now be moving on to the new summoning mechanic known as Pendulum Summoning.
Special summon, special summon, special summon, special summon.
Pendulum Summoning is the new mechanic introduced in Arc 5. Pendulum summons can only be done once per turn and requires 2 Pendulum Monsters with varying scales. You can Pendulum summon any number of monsters up to the number of summonable monsters and up to the maximum number of available monster zones. These monsters can be summoned from the hand or face-up pile of the extra deck. These monsters can be regular monsters that are not Pendulum Monsters but must be able to be special summoned through a Pendulum Summon. This means that you can Pendulum summon a regular effect monster but not a ritual monster from the hand. The range of monsters to be summoned is based on the gap between the 2 scales. If both scales are the same, you cannot Pendulum summon any monsters. If both scales differ by 1, such as a scale 3 and scale 4, you still cannot Pendulum summon any monsters. There must be a gap of at least 1, such as a scale 3 and scale 5. to pendulum summon the monsters in that gap's range, in this case, being able to pendulum summon monsters that are level 4. The pendulum summon is considered a special summon that does not start a chain, and monsters special summoned this way will be considered to be pendulum summon and special summon from the extra deck or their hand, depending on where they were special summoned from. The monsters summoned this way are summoned simultaneously as one summon. As such, they are vulnerable to cards such as Floodgate Trap Hole, or any card that negates summons. If the pendulum summon is negated, all monsters that would have been summoned will go to the graveyard, or any other appropriate location such as the banish zone if Macrocosmos is active. This includes any pendulum monsters, which means that they will not go back to the extra deck. This is because the monsters are not summoned successfully and cannot stay on the field, leaving the graveyard as an appropriate catch-all location. You are also not allowed to pendulum summon again for the turn. As this mechanic allows you to literally vomit out nearly an entire board of monsters each turn, the mechanic gives out a lot of advantage, such as having materials for synchro or tribute summoning. Given this advantage, Konami has decided to cripple the mechanic, such as in the Master Rule revision of April 2020 for the TCG OCG. And with that, the pendulum summoning mechanic is completed. As alluded earlier, pendulum monsters sometimes go to the extra deck, and sometimes they'll go to the graveyard or somewhere else. As such, I will now be talking about how they will be treated when they leave the field. As mentioned in previous parts, there is a huge confusion on where a pendulum monster goes when they leave the field. To reiterate, a pendulum monster will go to the appropriate location if sent from any other location. For example, from the deck or from the hand, to the graveyard or banish pile. The main confusion comes when a pendulum monster will leave the field. Assuming no other modifiers are active, all pendulum monsters will go face up in the extra deck if it leaves the field for the graveyard. Special modifiers that affect this rule are cards such as Macrocosmos that will force pendulum cards to the banish pile instead of face up in the extra deck. When a card's effect specifies to send a pendulum monster to the graveyard, the pendulum monster still goes to the extra deck. Another thing to note is that the rule applies only if the pendulum monsters would leave the field. Whether the pendulum monster is treated as a monster or spell, it will normally go to the extra deck. The only case to note is when a pendulum monster is used as an Xyz material. Xyz materials are never considered to be on the field. As such, the rule does not apply to those Xyz materials and they would go to the graveyard when detached. As a catch-all, all negated summons of pendulum monsters or negated activation of pendulum skills will send those pendulum monsters to the graveyard. The most important rule to know is that because pendulum monsters go to the extra deck when they leave the field, pendulum monsters can never be sent to the graveyard for the cost of a card effect when they are on the field. Pendulum monsters that leave the field may have some effects. For example, Guiding Ariadne in their monster effect text box. These effects can activate even if they are sent to the extra deck. And with this explanation, I'm done explaining the core gameplay mechanic, rulings, and features of pendulum monsters. However, I will talk more about how the new pendulum monster card group can be played or countered. As a preface, I do not specialize in pendulum-centered decks such as Endymion or Pendulum Magicians. Even worse, my general deck building is barely possible. To find deck lists, I suggest doing your own research to find out more, or may I suggest praying to the Pen God.
Investor, let's go! That's the meta! Trash ass meta! Penbest deck in my face!
In this section, I will talk about how pendulum monsters have different uses in their decks. In general, pendulum-focused decks want to stack their extra deck with multiple pendulum monsters and perform a huge pendulum summon. An example would be Cliffords, which use their mass number of monsters to perform a tribute summon of their boss monster, Apocryphal Towers. Some archetypes have a few pendulum monsters that allow the deck to perform a pendulum summon as a quality of life, while some are there to enable certain playstyles due to being easily placed on the field. An example would be Lunalights with their Lunalight Tiger allowing degenerate combos with its non-once per turn effect, and their Lunalight Wolf, which is an archetypal miracle fusion. Some pendulum cards exist by their own in a random archetype or group of cards. These cards usually just exist on the field or provide a once-off effect for the deck that it is placed in. An example would be Guiding Ariadne that allows counter traps to be practically free. There are also archetypes that use a combination of the previously mentioned features to allow combos and to build boards. Examples of these would be Pendulum Magicians, and Endymion. While Pendulum cards seem useful, they can be easily countered by a plethora of cards. These cards can be found in Duel Links already. As such, I'll be talking about how Pendulum Monsters are countered. After learning what Pendulum Monsters are and how they work, I'll now be talking about how to counter pendulums. As in most cases in Yu-Gi-Oh!, the most oppressive way to stop your opponent is to prevent them from playing their cards to begin with. The biggest problem for pendulum-focused decks is anti-spell fragrance, which forces players to set spells before activating them. As pendulum skills need to be played face up, this card stops the entire deck from playing essentially. However, in the context of Duel Links, it is likely that this card will not be introduced or possibly introduced at one copy like Light Imprisoning Mirror or Shadow Imprisoning Mirror. The next best alternative is to prevent the opponent from setting up their skills. As spells, pendulum skills can be negated and sent to the graveyard instead. Most pendulum decks do not have an immediate recovery option for their graveyard. However, pendulum-focused decks typically play multiple cards that can be used as replacements if their first pendulum skill was destroyed. Another method is to prevent the opponent from pendulum summoning properly. As a pendulum summon requires varied skills, you can interrupt the skills to place them in an awkward position and is forced to summon minimal number of monsters or is unable to pendulum summon at all. You can also consider leaving your opponent awkwardly placed skills instead of destroying them, as clock skills cannot be easily replaced by the opponent. However, several pendulum monsters have effects to destroy themselves or other skills for their effects. In reference to Duel Links, there are already existing tools to prevent a pendulum deck from immediately reaching top tier. These cards happen to be found in Blue Eyes decks, so that is another reason why this deck will stay around even longer. The cards I'm referring to are Blue Eye Spirit Dragon, Floodgate Trap Hole, and Champion's Vigilance, or Solemn Scolding, or any other card that negates summons. All three of these cards try to counter the advantage gaining Pendulum Summon in one way or another. An often overlooked effect of Blue Eye Spirit Dragon is that it prevents both players from summoning more than one monster at a time. As Pendulum Summons typically aim to flood the field, it will be suboptimal to summon only one monster through the Pendulum Summon. As the Pendulum Summon is considered one summon, one Floodgate Trap Hole will flip all Pendulum Summon monsters face down, preventing any further synchro or Xyz plays. However, this will still not prevent fusion or tribute summon plays. A summon negation like Champion's Vigilance can negate the whole summon, placing the opponent behind in card advantage. Any other form of negation, such as General Spell Negation, is useful to prevent the skills from being placed as well. There may be other ways to prevent pendulum decks from playing effectively, such as bot wipe spell negates, but these will be the few that are easily accessible to the Duel Links player base. If you are hoping to take anything from this video, just follow the 5 general rules that I have mentioned. General Rule 1. When pendulum monsters are in the pendulum zone, they are treated as spells upon being successfully activated on the field. General Rule 2. Pendulum summons can be done only once per turn and requires 2 pendulum monsters with varying scales. General Rule 3. Assuming no other modifiers are active, all pendulum monsters will go face up in the extra deck if it leaves the field for the graveyard. General Rule 4. As a catch-all, all negated summons of pendulum monsters or negated activations of pendulum skills will send those pendulum monsters to the graveyard. General Rule 5. Pendulum monsters can never be sent to the graveyard for the cost of a card effect when they are on the field. There are several ways to play and counter pendulum decks. There may be several rulings not mentioned in this video. Therefore, it is up to your own experience to determine what will happen in those scenarios and to read up specific rulings laid out by Konami. There may be interactions that have changed during the implementation of Pendulum Monsters into Duel Links. Therefore, please play around with them in-game first. I may be doing other guides and mechanics in the future, not being limited to Duel Links or Yu-Gi-Oh! So please keep a lookout for them. Please feel free to leave a like if you have enjoyed the video and subscribe if you enjoy what I put out.